Hello! I had too much fun dunking on Shapiro a little while back, so I thought I'd do some more today. To my genuine surprise, this video, titled Is Fascism Right-Wing?, is surprisingly kinda almost okay. Not really, but you know what I mean. I was baffled. He avoided most of the common worthless Hitler was actually a socialist arguments. He still made a few that are quite ridiculous, but he ended with a somewhat reasonable final statement. We'll cover that in a second. Best of all, he kinda sorta mean that the US is quasi-fascist in some sense, but I don't think it was in a way he intended. Before we start, be sure to watch my earlier Shapiro video to see another instance of him making a complete ass of himself here. Alright, let's jump right in.
Invariably, the people in the media who use the word fascism use it to refer to a politician of the right. But it turns out that fascism is right-wing only when compared with outright communism.
Now, at face value, this is a ridiculous statement, implying that fascism is left-wing, but less left-wing than Marxism. This is a snail's pace improvement, however, because last week, in the grand scheme of things, Shapiro was calling fascism socialism. He'll get into what his definitions of fascism are in just a second, along with our breakdown of why it's exactly lacking. But just to get this out of the way, socialism is a system in which the means of production, meaning factories, land, natural resources, etc., are owned in common, be it through a worker state, trade union syndicates, or other setups. And the nature of enterprises is democratic, unlike in capitalist society, where profit determines all enterprise decisions, along with other deeper details, which you can take a look at in these videos here. Extrapolating on a society-wide basis, this means the political supremacy of the working class, the suppression and eventual outright elimination of private property and enterprise, meaning not your home, guitar, or toothbrush, a national economic plan which is democratically determined, and a dedicated effort towards the abolishment of class. In essence, socialism is anti-capitalist in the fullest sense of the term. Fascism, however, isn't. Fascism has none of these characteristics, has historically always prioritized the interests of the capitalist class, the maintenance of the power of capital, the suppression of workers' movements, and the protection of private property, to the point of coining the term privatization in the first place. Let's carry on.
By American standards, fascism, which calls for unity of central authority and governmental control over private industry, among other agenda items, was far more left-wing than right-wing, which is why so many members of the American left were originally quite warm toward Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler.
I didn't know Americans deserve a different definition. The exceptionalism really runs deep, I guess. Regardless, unity of central authority and government control of private industry are very loosey-goosey terms, and ones many politically involved members of the capitalist class that previously supported Hitler immediately switched their tune to after the war. That aside, the US definitely has unity of central authority, and likewise does every other modern state in existence. This isn't the Middle Ages. Capitalism cannot properly function without at least the major centers of capitalism being highly centralized and enshrined into some legal system. Likewise, government control of private industry is an issue of semantics. What entails government control? To what extent? What counts as private industry? Is state capitalist directed control of nominally private enterprises still within the definition, etc., etc.? Of course, he hasn't given this any real thought. His argument is basically a sad attempt at pushing the big government equals authoritarian Nazi shtick so common in libertarian or other brain-dead circles, which happens to be the major funders of this sort of media, surprisingly enough. His argument basically boils down to it's socialism because it's the government doing stuff, sadly. Interestingly, one of the faces he flashed is that of W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I couldn't find any trace regarding him supporting or praising fascism, in fact just the opposite. I'm wondering why he put this in. He did likewise state this absolute banger. I won't bother going through the other people mentioned in this list, but I wouldn't be surprised if the story was the same there as well. Alright, are you ready for some supreme A-class brain rot?
Fascism is a very messy concept in that it crosses streams with a wide variety of other ideologies, ranging from Marxism to religious integralism.
Stalin, Lenin, Mao, Pinochet, Peron, Fujimori, El-Husseini, Tojo, Coughlin, Putin, all fascists, apparently. Whoa. Words have no meaning and political analysis is a joke. You know, he ends this video with essentially fascist is being rendered meaningless because it is being used against anyone a particular side doesn't like. But the silliness and hypocrisy is missed, apparently. Want to know something interesting with this list? Two of the people were either brought to power or maintained by the CIA, Pinochet and Fujimori, and what all on the list have in common aside from Stalin and Mao is blatant anti-communism. I wonder why that is. Regardless, no, fascism isn't difficult to define, nor is it that fluid. Fascism is capitalism in decay. When the contradictions of the capitalist system sharpen, reaction is emboldened, particularly by the capitalist class, which brings into play a combination between state and corporate power, the defining feature of fascism. Secondly, rampant anti-communism in the form of repression and outlaw of all parties, groups, trade unions, etc. that represent workers' interests. essentially all socialists. All strike activity, worker organizing, collective bargaining, or any other labor legislation is banned or severely limited. Following this, the banning and destruction of leftist literature of all strands, but specifically Marx, Lenin, and co. No matter what form fascism takes, from Latin America to Asia, this is the core of the project, outside of the usual traditionalism, militarism, selective populism, which has been beaten to death in liberal political science at this point. Let's dive into his definitions to break down why they're selective, inadequate, and silly, much like Benny Boy himself, at least if you ask his wife. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For a lot of research that I do for my videos, I end up hitting pages that aren't available in my location. That's frustrating as you can imagine, geo-restriction really does suck. But not with Atlas VPN. For those unaware, a virtual private network makes all of your internet traffic travel through an encrypted tunnel. This way, it protects you from spying, public Wi-Fi dangers, and hides your IP address and your online activities. It even allows you to change your location for all your researching needs. Currently, Atlas VPN has more than 6 million users worldwide, and boasts the best VPN deal on the market, with the most affordable online protection plan for just under $2 per month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So what are you waiting for? Go down to the description and click that link, use my code Hakeem, and get a 3-year subscription for just $183 a month with 3 months free. But that's not all. You get blazing fast speeds for streaming or gaming, unlimited protection for all your devices, an inbuilt ad and malware blocker, and you'll get to save some extra cash as Atlas VPN will find you the best deals online for everything from your online subscriptions to airlines, hotels, and more. Grab this big deal because now Atlas VPN Premium is just $183 per month plus 3 months extra, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Protect your privacy and get the many benefits of Atlas VPN for this ridiculously low price. You can grab this deal by clicking the link in the video description below. Be quick as it's a time-limited offer. Massive thanks to Atlas VPN for the sponsorship. This will allow me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is highly appreciated. Alright, back to the video.
First, fascism is characterized by a belief in the moral imperative of the centralized state.
Jesse, what the fuck are you talking about?
He goes back all the way to ancient Greece with this point, only to summarize it in the usual American libertarian way of freedoms being at a crossroads with what law the state lays. Literally every society to ever exist is fascist then, if your yardstick is the state is imposing some law that it limits an abstract freedom I ought to have, no matter how minuscule. It's a good thing pasteurization is standardized and implemented. It's a good thing that public pools are cleaned. It's good that medication and its production is heavily monitored. None of this is fascism. In essence, this point he's making is a little more than the verbalization of this clip right here.
Should someone have to have a government-issued license to drive a car?
Hell no!
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
The license to drive? You know, I'd like to see some competency exhibited by people before they drive.
Laughs aside, listing this by the US or South Korea, for example, gets check marks, though these countries are considered thriving democracies. Let's continue this game in the next clips.
Second, fascism is characterized by a belief in nationalism, or in its most virulent form, racial hierarchy. This sort of thought was exacerbated by Charles Darwin's theory, which was misread to embrace scientific racism. Such scientific racism became a dominant philosophy throughout much of the progressive world, which is why both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were advocates of eugenics.
Hey, would you look at that? I have a video on the topic. The point could be more nuanced, but I'll let it slide. Nationalism and a racial hierarchy aren't exactly one-to-one for the US currently, but a racial hierarchy was one of the founding myths of the US, so we can give a half point there, I guess.
Third, fascism is militaristic. It sees organization around military lines as a model for human existence, and recommends action in the world as a response to existential nihilism.
So far so good, still too liberal political science-y for my taste, but he's not blatantly wrong, which is a first for Ben. To note, militarism is a bread-and-butter American pastime, so another point there.
Historically, the most important fascist was actually not Hitler, but Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was the first politician to truly channel the roiling forces of fascism into one movement. The word fascism comes from the word fascis, a bundle of rods grouped together to form a Roman weapon. Fascism comes from Italy. Mussolini was originally attracted to the work of Marx, which was not anti-fascist in any real way. Many of the predicates of fascism also worked quite well for Lenin and Stalin, but Mussolini eventually came to realize rejecting Marx could serve his own ends. In the aftermath of World War I, Mussolini gained power by marching on Rome with the acquiescence of the king in order to supposedly save the state from Bolshevism.
Mussolini was a socialist only in the loosest possible definition, and gave up those ideas fairly quickly. Even then, he wasn't exactly light, because he held some out there views that bubbled up with his switch to fascism. About Marxism not being anti-fascist in any real way, this is just blatant bullshit. No group of capitalists or industrialists have ever funded communist parties and pushed them into power the way German capitalists did for the Nazi Party. Likewise for capitalists all across the world for other fascist movements. The only force to ever historically recognize the dangers of, stand up to, and actually defeat fascism were far left. At literally every turn, every armed group worth a damn that fought fascism was far left, from the Soviets to Yugoslavia to the resistance against every US-backed Latin American dictatorship. Indigenous resistance against fascism in Germany and Italy and everywhere else was socialist. While the West appeased Hitler, the USSR called for preemptive cooperative action against Germany. What about the Non-Aggression Pact? Has a dedicated video covering it eventually, but in the meanwhile, read Lacerdo's words about it here. Regardless, an essential read about left-wing resistance to fascism and capital's constant friendliness with fascism is Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds. To give you a taste, Mussolini rode into Rome with the full support of Italian industry. Likewise for Germany. Ben keeps pushing the government guiding private business point, but forgets that both Mussolini and Hitler showed their gratitude to their big business patrons by privatizing many perfectly solvent state-owned steel mills, power plants, banks, and steamship companies. Both regimes dipped heavily into the public treasury to refloat or subsidize heavy industry. Agribusiness farming was expanded and heavily subsidized. Both states guaranteed a return on the capital invested by giant corporations while assuming most of the risks and losses on investment. As is often the case with reactionary regimes, public capital was raided by private capital. Genuinely read Black Shirts and Reds, it's one of the most eye-opening books out there. Moving on, Ben's statement about Lenin or Stalin finding the predicates of fascism useful is also unfounded, and it's very telling that he didn't elaborate at all on this point. He's basically just talking out of his ass.
In 1927, Mussolini laid out the, quote, doctrine of fascism. He wrote, "Anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state."
This is something I always find interesting about the Shapiro-type grifters. He's made a lot of noise about his Judaism, and he loves to appeal to an American evangelical Christian audience. Both of these communities are ones firmly rooted in a collective approach to society and social organization, through the family, community, church, and so on. How does he rationally reconcile this with the destructive hyper-individualism of late-stage capitalism that he seems to love so much? He doesn't, that's how. His ideology is a mishmash of whatever is popular to people of a certain conservative ideological persuasion this week, along with the political and lobbying ends of the billionaires that fund his little propaganda shows.
This implies organization and expansion, potential if not actual. That expansion meant not just militarization, but gargantuan public works, massive expansion of the welfare state, corporatization of the private sector, with the government leaving private industry intact but essentially working hand in glove with it to control it and channel its resources in the direction sought by the fascists.
So, physical expansion of the state, as well as apparently infrastructure projects, are fascism now. How is this not the same as what you claim the other side is doing, with everything I don't like being fascism? The welfare state being built into fascism is a strange myth. Nazi Germany inherited welfare policies from earlier German republics, and at many times expressed anti-welfare policies, for example free dismissal of workers, wage cuts, longer hours, child labor, etc., etc. The corporatization of the private sector bit just shows he doesn't understand or refuses to recognize that this centralization of capital is a natural development of capitalism. Massive levels of corporatization have occurred in the US, for example, and I touched on this a little more in my earlier video here. In summary, the evidence is undeniable that the corporatization of the private sector is a natural trend of competition within capitalism, b, occurs a lot of the time illegally with the cooperation of the capitalist state, and c, centralizes industry in fewer and fewer conglomerates which subsequently use their leverage to skirt market regulations, rules, or even standard function. Likewise, he has this set up the wrong way around. It isn't the state directing private industry, but private industry directly supporting fascist development at times of heightened class struggle. Afterwards, they continue to exert their influence in a mutually collaborative effort to primarily protect capital and the interests of that particular capitalist class. Umberto Eco has an interesting write-up about the philosophical approach of fascism, but the mass line definitions listed under fascism are a great summary in my opinion. Pause if you're interested. He goes on to shill his Genucell garbage cream again, with the usual bloated claims of it curing your erectile dysfunction or whatever. I shat on it in the previous Shapiro video, so I won't do it again here.
Hitler was not the only fascist to follow Mussolini's lead. Fascist regimes took over in a variety of countries, ranging from Hungary and Romania to Paraguay and eventually Iraq. Other states, ranging from Spain to Argentina, mimicked many aspects of fascism, leading many to label them quasi-fascist.
Fascism was never practiced nor ever took root in Iraq. The 1941 coup was a fairly nuanced anti-British move by Iraq to attempt independence, which was supported by the Germans as it happened in the middle of World War II. This fell apart almost immediately and the British controlled Iraq again very shortly afterwards. Regardless, he seems to recognize actual fascist states in his list, so why the weird barrage of figures earlier in the video? I wonder.
Certain aspects of fascism, particularly in the economic realm, could even be seen under FDR in the United States. FDR's New Deal, complete with government resources directed at forcing economic conformity, controlled huge swaths of American life.
Okay, he went off the deep end here. FDR did that in accordance with and reluctant approval of the American ruling class as an attempt to prevent actual radical change which was on the doorsteps of the US. Infrastructure projects are not fascism, my man. Stop trying to pass your appeasing libertarians nonsense as fact.
This is why the term fascism is so attractive in political discourse. Everybody thinks of brown shirts and small mustaches when they invoke fascism, but there are a lot of aspects of fascism that survive in a variety of forms. Corporatism, government working hand in glove with industry, is a form of economic fascism. Racial hierarchies can be indicative of fascist thinking, particularly when combined with differential treatment under law. Militarism can be termed fascist, particularly when its resources are directed at domestic populations. Few people will admit to being fascist today. It'd be far more useful for everybody to simply critique policies with reference to history, but without reference to the buzzword that poisons everyday discourse. We can have good and interesting conversations about the value of corporatism, for example, without invoking Hitler. We can talk about opposing the shortcomings of atomistic individualism without invoking the Holocaust.
I like how this is the only correct part of his video, but he presents clips supposedly indicative of racial hierarchy in the US with discussions of black history and income discrepancies between whites and blacks, as if African Americans are privileged in the US or something. How dishonest and silly do you have to be, genuinely? There is different treatment under law in the US, with African Americans getting worse treatment across the board from employment to incarceration. This is not niche knowledge. Moving on, apparently vaccinations are fascism too, according to the corporatism and injection clip. He just forgot that over 1 million people in the US died from COVID. Interesting that weapons manufacturer company penetration into US politics and the corporatization of every facet of American existence isn't shown in his clips here. Ignoring the choice of clips, if you just listen to the audio itself, this is the only decent clip from Shapiro I've ever heard, even if he's being super disingenuous with the footage he's showing and the point he's trying to convey, but we're ignoring that for now. Shapiro has been a bad ideologue for his entire career, so when he puts out something slightly less garbage for once, it actually stands out, even if it's still pretty bad. Alright, that's all for this time. Read Black Shirts and Reds. How many times do I need to yell that? If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching. Oi, Dubois. Fuck it, I'm just gonna say Dubois, and people correct me, I'll tell them that French is a waste of time.